Well, welcome. See so many people here in the morning. It's early. And as of, I should mention, as of January 1st, you can buy a 64-ounce soda in New York. Freedom is back. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm never exactly sure where I'm going. I always start and I take notes and I never use them. But we will end up in a pretty good direction. There's a lot that I want to say. There's a lot of important things going on. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this issue. When Donna talks about beyond housing, you can bet this issue is beyond housing. It's 34 years ago. And we've traveled a lot of paths and moved in a lot of directions. Now, I want to tell you where I'm going to come at with this issue so it puts it in perspective, because I will say a lot of things. I am neither a liberal nor am I conservative. I think the answers are in the middle, and I think the best public policy comes from joining those two answers together. I do have 10 years experience in government in New York, setting up all of the homeless shelters at the beginning, an issue that we never thought would go this long or this deep into the population as it has. I've been teaching at the university at Columbia for 36 years, so I know the public policy and the government aspect of this on how this can be incrementally dealt with, and I've watched that now for almost a generation. And finally, being the president of Homes for the Homeless has been the most unique aspect because it's been on the front lines working with about 140,000 families, about 90,000 children, and about 60-something, 140,000 individuals and 60-something thousand families. We've learned a lot. I want to share that with you today. And I want to begin by talking about our new mayor talks about a tale of two cities, the haves and the have-nots. I'm going to talk about a tale of three nations. The haves have less and have nothing. And it's a sliding scale. And as you move through time in this country, you watch that scale move deeper, higher, lower, but it moves. And right now we're on a downswing. So I want to begin with that, and I think it's appropriate to begin by talking about what is the anniversary last week of the war on poverty. You know, I am always amazed when I hear politicians speak. And I was more amazed than ever last week as they started to say, well, the war on poverty is over. Yeah. To put that in perspective, let me tell you how I'm going to approach this. You know, one of the greatest teachers of all time was Socrates, because Socrates understood a good teacher doesn't teach a subject. A good teacher teaches students how to think about a subject, how to question a subject, how to reason real answers. And of course, from Socrates comes Plato, and from Plato comes Aristotle, the great philosophers of all time. So we're going to take a Socratic approach to this, okay? And we're going to begin, and I'm going to ask a lot of questions. And because I'm paying for the conference, I'm going to answer them myself. You get to do that. Isn't that great? You get to do that when you teach, too. So I'm going to wear my academic hat, all right? And I'm going to begin by reading some news headlines that I think are very pertinent in putting this conference in perspective. I'm going to begin with these, and then I'm going to discuss them. So listen to this. This is from the newspaper. The two professional political parties both straddle the key questions of our time, but the new class party is silent about nothing. The parties lie to us, the political speakers mislead us. U.S. senators have come to represent something more than a state or a region. They represent the principalities and powers in business. Immigration continues unchecked. They form a standing army of labor. Everywhere, properties are in foreclosure and the government does little. Factories are shutting down entirely. 642 banks have closed their doors, and a fourth of our heavy industries are in decline or dying. Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. Now, that really talks about today, right? Well, those headlines are from the 1890s. It really talks about yesterday and today. And what I want to do in discussing poverty first, before I really go into homelessness, is put that in perspective. How can 120 years ago be exactly like today? Because what happens in between is what defines America, what defines that sliding scale that we're talking about, what defines where each and every one of us are going to live at some point in time and perhaps end up at the end of the game. So if you take a look at that, you have to ask what happened in between that 120 years? What took place that we are back where we were so long ago? And the answer really goes to the war on poverty. You know, there are only two periods in the 20th century when real strides are made for the citizen. Prior to that, government Government's role was military, highways, build railroads, rivers, deal with all of that. But only twice has government stepped into the picture in the last century. And the first, of course, was during the Great Depression with the New Deal, and you got Social Security. And finally, with the war on poverty and the Great Society. Now, if you saw the New York Times last week, when they talked about the war on poverty, they had a great article on all that had been achieved, all that was left undone, but they gave a great map and a scale of what poverty would be today if it wasn't for the war on poverty and Social Security. You know, poverty, we're now at 16%. 16% is a pretty rough number because we were down to 10 at 1980. If we didn't have those programs, we'd be at 32%. A third of this country would be living in poverty. And those numbers are deep. So what did the war on poverty do that it was so bad? The war on poverty gave us Medicare and Medicaid. Now, people argue in Congress, well, this costs a lot of money. If you can put a price tag on health, let me know about it, okay? Number two, they gave us food stamps, which without right now, in this country, without the food stamp program that exists, our poverty numbers would be through the roof. And what's wrong with feeding young kids, poor people, and senior citizens? Because that's where that money goes. And the unemployed at present, okay? Third, they gave us Head Start. The Great Society, the war on poverty, Head Start, because we know, regardless of what some of these conservative things argue, the studies show that if a child goes through a Head Start and a daycare program, he or she is more likely to be employed, more likely to achieve higher educational levels, and more likely to be a good citizen in the long run. It works. They also gave us HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Now, housing and urban development's an important piece because we get our low-income housing and we get housing for the poor and low-income people in the 1960s that didn't exist before. We had housing authorities from the 30s through the Great Depression, but virtually nothing was done up to that period. Another important role. And most importantly, not most, but right up there, is the bang to education, the Secondary and Elementary Secondary Education Act that made schools more equal, that made public education high values in math, in science, in reading, things that are in chaos today. These are all good things, but they're incomplete. So when I see politicians last week, and they say, well, yes, we fought the war on poverty and poverty won. No. The best way to understand it for them, I should tell them it's so simple. If you don't put enough gas in the car, you're never getting where you're going. You're going to stop. That's basically what happened. We stopped funding this program. And the war on poverty isn't big government. People like to use that word. It's good government. It's caring government. It's government that moves society forward. And that's only really happened twice. During the Great Depression with Social Security to eliminate poverty for the elderly, and during the war on poverty, which really lifted all boats and tide. Now, what was the war on poverty about? Well, people argue all kinds of things, but the war on poverty was about two things. Number one, investing in communities. Investing in communities by investing in people and investing in infrastructure, and that's what model cities did, and that's what these programs did. But number two, and now we start to head towards homelessness with this, it was about opportunity. Opportunity to participate in the American dream. Now, what does that mean? People think it was about giveaways. No, it was about opening doors. The war on poverty and the Great Society simply said everyone should have a chance to participate and achieve the American dream. And what is the American dream? Well, it's basically three things. It is a good job, it is a good education for your kids, and it is a good place to live. And that's where government focused. And you know, when the war on poverty started in the Great Society, there was enormous support. I mean, Johnson was elected by a landslide. Enormous support. And it went forward with a bang. Everybody was involved, and it moved mountains. It's standing still now, but it did move mountains. And if it wasn't there today, boy, there'd be a lot of problems in this country. So we move forward, and what happens? And here's where we start to turn towards the era we're living in. This starts to define why all of those issues I read about to you in the 1890s exist here in 2014. Government had good intentions, but government had poor methodology. The war on poverty in the Great Society, when they talked about allowing people to get good jobs, the idea was great. Everybody said, yes, all Americans should have great jobs. But the methodology was poor. And the methodology was tied around quotas. And quotas created a problem, because all of these programs were supported by an overwhelming majority of the American public, but you began to alienate the American public. When you told a worker, look, someone else is going to get this job before you, because things haven't been fair, and so we're going to move people to the front of the line. You started to alienate the people that supported these programs. That's just one, and that takes place in the 60s. So now you're alienating blue-collar workers, you're alienating all the people that came and voted for this stuff. The second move that government made was education. We want everyone to have a good education, and why shouldn't they in this country? Again, the problem was not in the policy, the problem was in the methodology. The methodology was, we will bus children. We will bus poor kids to your middle-class neighborhood, and we will bus your middle-class kids to poor neighborhoods, and that will really make this work better. Well, people said, you think so? Take a look, yeah. Look at Boston, what happened. The public school system was destroyed, right? That kind of integration policy in education alienated people more. People said, I moved to this community for this school, I work hard to keep my kids here, and now you're shipping them out? It didn't work, you alienated more of the public. Now the third one takes us towards homelessness. These all, they're cumulative, but this third one, and most people don't really quite put this together, is where homelessness really starts to, it begins, it gets its roots. The third thing, and during the 70s they did education. The third policy, by the time HUD caught up, was in the beginning, late 70s, and it was housing. And now it would be, we're going to give people good housing. Good. Where are we going to build it? In middle-class communities. Now you've alienated everybody. You've alienated people on jobs, you've alienated them on education, and you're alienating them where they live. And people said, what are you talking about? I moved here, I pay high taxes here, my kids go to school here, I work here, and now you're telling me all these things are being taken away in one way or another. And it is there that we begin to see government step back. It's there. This is a very damaging period. It's there that the public starts to question what role government should play. What role will government have on this sliding scale of where I'm going to be? And you reach 1980, and I should say that poverty, by the time Johnson's elected and starts to put these programs together, poverty in the United States is at about 19%. By 1980, it's 10%. So poverty's coming down. People aren't happy about what's going on or how we're doing this, but it's coming down. 1980, Ronald Reagan understood politics extremely well. Reagan takes a look at this and says, you know what? The term for this is, I will get government off your back. And what does that mean? I will get government out of your workplace, I will get government out of your school, and I will get government out of your community with housing. And that begins a major turning point in America. 34 years ago, America takes a radical right turn, for better or for worse. It takes this turn. And what they do, Reagan plays to the suburbanites, to the blue-collar Democrats who had supported Johnson, to everyone else, and says, listen, follow me, I will get government out of your life, and let the invisible hand of the world take over. And so he does that. And he gets elected, rightfully so, great political strategist. He's elected, and then the question is, well, look, now we're in here, so what do we do? And then the answer is, just like that movie with Kevin Costa, if you don't build it, they can't come. If you don't fund it, they won't be here. They cut all the programs, and we begin to unravel the safety net. That's the great period of, well, we're going to fine-tune the safety net. We freeze aid for dependent children. We do away with job training programs. We eliminate CETA that put so many people to work rather on the welfare rolls. We cut back on daycare Head Start centers. We stop funding certain aspects of public education so that we're not moving kids around. We offer vouchers, so we shuffle them around in different ways. We really start to dismantle everything that made a difference in America. Now, good or bad depends on your political philosophy, because all of these things cost money, and all of that's driven by taxes. But the American public said enough. And Reagan was supported, these programs were put in place, and with HUD and public housing, it comes to a halt. So little public housing has been built in this country, in reference to the scale it was being done in the late 60s and early 70s, that it is remarkable, and homelessness starts to grow. And so when you hit the 1980s, they defunded HUD totally. HUD would never build anything to scale again. It would be a maintenance agency. It would maintain what was done. So when you hit the 1980s, you start to see why we're here, homelessness. And you see homelessness as probably a real housing issue in that day, okay? Homelessness were people who lost their home for all kinds of reasons. They didn't pay the rent, they paid some medical bill, or they came out of welfare from a welfare family, suddenly find themselves on public assistance, don't know where to live. Mother says she can't leave her anymore, too many kids around. And so homelessness starts to grow, and we start to see it in America. And we start to approach this as a housing issue. First, as an emergency issue, because we don't think it's going to go that far. We decide, when I was down in government, we said, well, this is just a little thing. This is a little bleep on the scale. Don't worry about it. And the mayor used to yell every day, make this go away. Don't worry about it. It's going away. It went away, all right. Went right through the ceiling. And the day came when we had to say, listen, this isn't going away, and we're going to have to get serious about what we do. And the immediate answer was to open emergency shelters. Congregate shelters where families were jammed together on cots with just like a shower curtain around them, people on gymnasium floors, whatever you could do just to get people off the street. And we thought that perhaps at some point it would level off, but it never did. And in the 1980s, across America, homelessness starts to become very visible. You know, we had always had people who were poor, who wandered around, they had mental health problems, you'd see them on the street, but we never had what started to grow. We never had families like this coming in. There had always been in New York, for example, about 800 families. 800 families that were always there because there was a fire, something happened, and the city would put them in hotels for a short period, and we'd be able to rehouse them. All of a sudden, there's 5,000 families, and we can't rehouse them all. And we're loading up welfare hotels and congregate shelters and all kinds of really bad housing options. And that's happening across America at the same time. No one knows what to do. If you go to New Jersey, everyone's living in motels along the highway still. We have kids growing up in motels, becoming adults with their own kids in those motels. So what you start to see is a transition. And you start to see a transition not only in what the issue is, but in who the population is. You know, in the early 80s, it was an older woman with adolescent children. She had a work history, had a high school diploma. She was employable and making on her own, something happened. But by the time you get to the end of the 80s, you see a different population. You see a very young mother with 1, 2, maybe 3 kids under her arm. There is no individual father. There are several male fathers of these children. Half of these parents hadn't completed high school. Half of these parents are victims of domestic violence. We find today that 32% age out of foster care and into the homeless system. Another almost 17% grew up in shelters today who were children in shelters a decade ago. So you start to see a transition in the population. And then you start to see what is happening with homelessness here. How is this changing? What is this about? Now, it's here that we come to a crossroads almost. You know, 1990s, we can shoot ahead real quick. Poverty just shoots back up from that 10% to around 14, 15%. And in the 90s, we reformed welfare in 96 to throw another rock in the boat, so to speak. And that drives more people. We talk about the welfare rolls are down. That's terrific. But all the other rolls, be they juvenile justice, whether they be criminal rolls, whether they be shelter rolls, are up. And the numbers are through the ceiling. And here we are now in 2014, and we still have conferences on homelessness. We still hear arguments what homelessness is about. I'm told all the time it's simply a housing issue. My answer is, where have you been? It's anything but. First and foremost, it's a children's issue, and that should never be forgotten. And second, it's an education issue, because all of these kids are at risk, and these populations change, and they shift. We see a shift in this population right now. As we track this, we see suddenly that we haven't seen for almost 18 years. The population is growing extremely young again, which means we're moving into a new generation. In New York City now, 60% of all of the children are under the age of 6. That's a whole new wave of population, but that's an important moment from a public policy point of view. It's a chance to capture this next generation. We see transitions in parents who haven't worked. It's more pronounced among the young population who don't have the skills to be put to work. Yet, we're told it's simply a housing issue. Now, I'm going to use New York as an example because New York has done a few things over the Bloomberg years, all right? And New York has, everyone says, well, you know, you can't use New York because it's different. How so? It's just bigger. It's not different. And I got news for you, about 10% of everybody in our system's from elsewhere in the country. They just keep coming and turning through. Tonight, there are 55,000 people, men, women, and children in New York City shelters. Now, if you're going to study this issue and understand it, that's a pretty good place to start, if you ask me. And if you take a hard look at it, what do you see? What is going on? Well, in New York, during the final Bloomberg years, the mayor said, I will reduce homelessness by 2/3, if you don't know this story. Why? Because he can do everything, all right? And so he's going to reduce homelessness by 2/3 in 5 years. What he did was double homelessness 100% in the last 5 to 6 years. And I'm going to explain why and how. Because right now the debate in this country, this crossroads, is between this idea that homelessness is a single-dimensional issue, a housing issue. And if you simply rehouse people rapidly, you will make this go away. The other side of the coin, if you've worked in this area, and if you're on the front lines or if you're studying it academically, should show you and tell you that homelessness is a multidimensional issue. If you ask the question, if Socrates would ask the question, is being without a home homeless? Yes. So I asked the fellow over here, is being without a home and coming out of foster care homeless? Oh, yeah. Is being without a home and having mental health problem with meds? Well, yeah. Is being homeless, you don't have any education, so you can't get job skills, you can't get a job, is that being homeless? Yeah. If you're a victim of domestic violence, you don't have a home, or you're homeless? Yeah. Well, then homelessness is a multidimensional issue, because these characteristics exist in one way or another with a certain percentage of the population we serve. Now, I'm not going to say that rapid rehousing is bad, because it's good. Of course we want to rapidly rehouse people, as fast as we can, housing first. But now the question from a policy perspective, with a little bit of history I told you, is for who? Who is rapid rehousing and housing first appropriate for? It's appropriate for the family that just fell into this system, the working poor family that just has a short stay because they didn't pay the bill, they couldn't afford, the rent went up, and we move them out as fast as we can. This one-dimensional point of view, which New York adopted big time. They took Bloomberg down to Washington, put him in front of the national conference, made him talk about his great program. It's always amazing. They always talk about how great it is, and when it explodes, you never see him again. Always works that way. And that program was put in place, and that thing said homelessness is just one-dimensional, rapid rehousing. We're going to give a rental subsidy, and we have to talk about that and housing too here, a rental subsidy for time-limited period, and then people will be on their feet and they will be rehoused and everything's perfect. Well, that was the City of New York's approach. And that's a policy approach, and good or bad, it's public policy. Well, that's one way to go at it. The other way is to really think, what will happen here? What is the housing stock we have? And let's talk about that for a minute, because people talk about housing like it's all over the place. Every time I talk to people, oh yeah, affordable housing. Oh yeah, we're going to house people. Where? Why do you think these families are here? Because they went to Century 21 and they told them there's nothing available? No. They're here because there isn't affordable housing. And here's your examples. Last time, the number of low-income renters were equal to the number of available low-income units was 1970. All right? 1970, it was in balance. And since then, it's gone like this. Today, there's a 6 million person deficit in low-income renters, a shortage of 6 million units. Now, that's not going to be produced overnight. So that's your first thing. The second thing is we talk about developing affordable housing, and we do, and we should, and we must. But now the second part of the question is affordable for who? All of this housing stock just isn't going to be turned over, in general, to people. It's going to be geared to people who can maintain it, who can pay rents that go to supporting the infrastructure, that keep it going, and then some will be set aside for some low-income people. So there are winners and losers in this. Now, the Bloomberg administration developed 167,000 units, maintained some, and developed some. But it didn't put a dent in anything. The homeless numbers continued to grow and grow and grow. The new mayor has committed to generating another 200,000, and that will probably happen, but it will not alleviate the homeless problem. Homelessness, if people don't get it by now, is part of the American landscape. It is part of our history, and will be part of our history for a long time to come. It is part of these waves that I spoke about that come and go with the nature of the times. The nature of the times aren't good. If you're going to build a number of low-income housing that's necessary to fill that 6 million gap and then some, then you're going to have the federal government play a role. And if you look at the federal government today, don't have high hopes of building anything. They can't even put a budget together every 6 months. So it's a long haul. So if you have this long haul and you have this situation, what do you do? What is the answer? So New York thought the answer was to rapidly rehouse people, and this would work, and let's tackle the whole system and the entire shelter system in New York. Now remember, 55,000 people, over 140 facilities, shelters, what we call tier 2s, hotels, cluster site housing, which is simply apartments from real slumlords put together. The city has to use them and pay all kinds of money for it. That whole system was shaken to the core in New York. And it's important because what I'm going to tell you when we finish with the Bloomberg thing is that Bloomberg gets a lot of credit from me because he tested things and showed they don't work. Saved a lot of time and saved a lot of money. Yeah, and you'll see that in a moment because I'm going to share a video with you on this. But the picture I'm going to paint here and that I'm talking about is we are faced not with a housing issue, we're faced with a poverty issue, a severe poverty. People say to me all the time, well, I write articles and I research this, you know, there's no difference between a homeless family and a housed family. Really? Well, then why aren't they housed? There are plenty of people who are on public assistance who maintain their life pretty darn well. Okay? There is a difference. The other thing that's happening around here, before this video, when we talk about this housing and how we're going to house people, is gentrification. Now, everywhere you live in this country, you must be experiencing it because it's taking place. Old neighborhoods are being revived. In New York, it's taking place like fire. I mean, this is now a totally different place, a totally different world. Communities that were poor communities, some communities like East New York or East Village that was drug infested have transitioned. And what happens with that transition? What do you do with all those families that live there? You know, poor families, working low-income families live in communities for generations. The communities work for them. They grow up there. They have family there. They know the people who run the stores, the businesses there. All of a sudden, we gentrify them. By gentrifying them, we have created something new. We have destabilized poverty and low-income communities. Destabilize them how? Destabilize them by middle-class people moving in and pushing poor people out. And where do you go? And I'll give you the example. Bed-Stuy in New York was one of the poorest, most dangerous communities. Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. It is now one of the hottest communities. The white population increased 167%. People with college degrees increased 56%. People with master's degrees, 59%, and rents went up almost 30%. Now, poor people can't live in those communities anymore. We transitioned it. So what did they do? They moved to the next community, which is Brownsville in New York, which is one of the poorest, most dangerous communities in this city. What happened there? Now you have a competition of not middle class against poor, but poor against poor. Winners and losers. The poorest, the least able to maintain their standard of living there, ended up in a shelter system. Bed-Stuy is the #1 feeder in Brooklyn to the New York City shelter system. Brownsville is now #3. This is happening community after community. This is now happening in the Bronx. This is what happens in all of your communities, whether it's in Tennessee, Kentucky, Texas. Once you start to transition that housing in those poor communities and transition it up, poor people move. And what we're doing is redistributing poverty in this country, redistributing it in different places. And in the end, it gets redistributed into the shelter system, okay? Now, it's 30 years of what we call a shelter system, and that's where we're going to go at the end of this. 30 years of dealing with this issue in a poor way, an inefficient way, in a way that we should have learned by now. So let me share this video with you on what New York did, because it paints the picture much clearer than what I can do. And then let me talk to you about where the future of this issue goes. Right, so the caution light is on, okay? If that doesn't say it all, I don't know what does. Now, people will say, and they say to me all the time, I get phone calls and emails every week about this rapid rehousing and housing first. What's the answer? What's the answer? There is no answer. The real fact is that rapid rehousing works, again, for certain families. And for other families, it's time to move the crossroads in the other direction. And then the question is, what is a shelter? Is a shelter still a shelter? And the answer is no. It's time to get off this thing. Shelters never should have been called that. It stereotypes these families, stereotypes these kids. Shelters are low-income housing for the future. They are the surrogate for it. Until we're going to build it, they have become places where kids go to work and parents go to school and people live, and for extended periods. So then the answer is, what do we do? How do we work this system? We work it first by changing it, all right? By changing it and not drinking the Kool-Aid, because I know what goes on with this policy. This policy is driven out of Washington with the idea that if you want money, then you're going to follow rapid rehousing. And I will tell you what will happen. Remember the 10-year plans? Everybody had a 10-year plan? It's 15 years later. What happened to that? Everybody with those great ideas are gone, all right? They're down in Florida and all Costa Rica. We're still here, all right? The same thing with rapid rehousing would happen in New York. Right now, New York has absolutely no plan They put the ship right into the rocks. It cost them $1 billion. You know what $1 billion in government error rate is? That's a phenomenal amount of money. That's a phenomenal amount, and they don't know what to do. But the answer is right under their nose. You must take the politics out of this. And the Washington thing, if you don't buy into it, I know what they do. They call you in, they yell at you, and they take your money away, right? They threaten to take it. It's time to have a discussion on this, and that's what I'm here to talk about now. It's time to have a discussion. This conference is beyond housing, because this issue is beyond housing. This issue is beyond shelters. This issue is about schools. This issue is about education. This issue is about kids. And this issue is about very young families that are at risk that are going to cost us not $1 billion, but $500 billion across this country if we don't stand up as providers, as educators, and do what we know is right. We know that this issue is different. We know it's not one-dimensional, it's multidimensional. And that brings a lot into here. You know, if you lose a kid into the foster care system, people say the other argument is, oh, shelters are so expensive. You think so? Tell me what the alternative cost. Well, a shelter can be $30,000. Well, you know why it's that? Because there's no funding stream created by this great Congress to do it the right way. So they use what exists, and they've done that. That funding stream exists from the Great Depression. That's where that funding stream comes from. It's been here for 70, 80 years. Change it if you don't like it. But if you don't have a shelter today, and if you can't put someone in shelter, what is the alternative? Well, the kids will have to be removed at some point because they're at risk. Well, foster care is $40,000 a go. So a family of 3, 2 kids in foster care is $80 grand. What happens to the mother? Well, the mother then, she ends up in a single shelter. Or in some other part of the system, there's another 20,000. So figure it out, 100 versus 30 for the time being. You must make these facilities tools. Now, I'll tell you a story that was in the New York Times that maybe you read that really sets up what to do with this. It was the story of this young girl, Dasani. You see it? Front page. It's going to be a Pulitzer Prize story for sure. And it was about this family. And it went on for days to see the Times commit so much paper to this. And it talked about this family's been in the shelter system 10 years. The parents are substance abusers. There's all these kids in the family. Some have problems, this and that. And they follow this young girl, and they paint a sad story. But that story raises 2 questions, 2 very important questions. Number 1, did the system fail the family? Or number 2, did the family fail themselves? And then, as a citizen, it raises a question. Is our system working and doing it right? Or is this family responsible for their own sad times? 10 years they're in the shelter system. Now, how does the city of New York respond? Not the way I would have. They say, we spent $1 million on this family. Well, if you spent $1 million on this family, I'm headed to the shelter tonight because I'm next. Let me tell you. Who are they kidding? Instead, talk about what the issue is. It's a multidimensional issue. It's not easy for us to fix it for this family. Every time we fix one aspect, we fix one hole in the dam, another one opens up. That's what that story's about. But that story raises the question, and who's responsible, the family or the system? The answer is really a little of both. Bad choices, okay? Bad system. That's the thing. So what should the system be? What should we be looking for? Well, we now have to accept that these are not shelters anymore. This is a form of housing, temporary housing until times get better. If they get better in this economic situation, who knows? The employment, trying to employ people, which is really the answer for these parents, is extremely difficult. We talk about raising the minimum wage. That's not going to change your life because as you raise the minimum wage, you're seeing low-paying jobs, jobs that people are working in today, disappear. And not because of the wage, but because of technology. All these jobs now, you see people trying to unionize, McDonald's, trying to unionize, Applebee and all. Those jobs, I was at LaGuardia Airport. If you've been there recently, it's the most remarkable thing. I see iPads everywhere. I thought these were iPads to work on. So I grabbed one. They're menus. Anywhere in that airport, you can sit, punch in what you want, pay with your credit card, and they will bring it to you, or you can come and pick it up. They have runners. That's the future. That is the future. All of these jobs now that people are pushed down into are going away. America's experiencing a notch-down generation, an economic notch-down generation. You're seeing families who lived as middle class before now living lower. When we talk about homelessness, it's not just about poor people. It's not just about low-income working families. It's about middle-class people who lost their jobs too. It's Bergen County, where they're experiencing suburban homelessness with young single mothers who are divorced, who are losing their homes because they lost their job. It's about people. It's the sliding scale. And that's why I say those have some, and have none, because that's where we're headed. And the big problem is, when you look at this nationally, and we continue to cut these programs, you know, these programs are nothing more than regulatory programs of poverty. Just like you regulate the airlines so that they don't fly into the wall, and trucks so the tires don't come off, it's the same thing. How much are you willing to spend to bring poverty to a level where it's not dangerous to everyone? How much are you willing to spend on the quality of life? And we're deregulating it. When they cut the food stamp program like they did, they put it at risk. You know, when you finally push the system down far enough and people have nothing more to lose or give, then you get change. We're not getting that in America yet, politically, at the electoral box, because we did not just finish a Great Recession, friends. We just finished a contemporary depression. This would have been a depression. And in many ways it is for people. But we have Social Security, we have unemployment, we have food stamps, we have things that balanced it out. The more those things disappear, the more political change and political risk and protest and things appear. Look at history, not just this country, but everywhere. That's how the system works. But we are at a crossroads with this issue where it's time to make a decision. It's time to take the word shelter out and think of this as a residential community resource center, because that's what it is. Residential community resource center. Put the services in there. Put the services to serve not just homeless families who are there, we're working on problems for that moment, but the community too. And I'll give you some examples of it. But first, I want to say that it must be a tiered system, a system of housing first for families, of housing second for families who haven't worked in a few years, families who haven't completed their education, but if they do, they can get a good job, and housing third for those families that have, like the family we just spoke about, the most severe set of problems that we have to deal out first before we move them up and out of the system. We have to think of this three-dimensional, not one-dimensional. You just saw what happened. That doesn't work. And no one knows what to do in the city of New York. A city this big, no one knows what public policy to put in place next while the rest of the country runs down the hill the wrong way. You know, this issue is like, back to Greek mythology, it's like Sisyphus. You roll the rock up the hill, a few years it's down here again. Let's start all over. It's time to make a change. It's time to talk about this in a different way and think about it in a different way. When I talk about a residential community resource center, I'm talking about what we've learned at Homes for the Homeless. Homes for the Homeless has 26 years of frontline experience. These facilities are the front line of the war on poverty now. It's continued here. It's not continued in a big scale out there anymore. It's continued in every one of these shelters that must be transitioned into a community center. Let me tell you what we've learned. We've learned that if you put daycare here, what I said before, you can put daycare in these facilities. It means so much to the future of these kids to be able to compete as they go to higher school, into higher employment, and a higher rate, and be employable. The second thing we've learned is that put after-school programs here. We know that homeless children move 2 or 3 times a year. Each one of those moves is an educational setback of 6 months. Do that twice, you're a year back. We find that in the 4th grade, homeless children start to get back in the 4th and 5th grade, and they start to drop out in the 10th and the 11th. And then they cost us a lot more in other systems that they get into. Teen pregnancy and all of that comes with it. We've also learned that foster care is such an important piece. We learned at a family respite center, a crisis nursery, that when a family is at risk, doing this for so many years at Homes for the Homeless, try to remove a child from a facility that has 255 families. Try to remove that child when the government comes. It's chaos. It's screaming. It's yelling. It's a mob scene. And what's the end result? A child in foster care that's going to cost us $40,000 a year. That child in foster care is going to move up to 6 times by age 18. What does that child leave foster care with? A nomadic lifestyle. He or she thinks this is the way it is. He or she goes out, gets a boyfriend, a girlfriend, has a kid, ends up in a shelter system eventually after they can't stay with the aunt, the grandmother, the cousin, or the uncle. All right? We feed our own system over and over again. We need that preventative service within that facility, and it costs nothing. That service costs $1,700 a year per child. No legal separation. They work with the family within the facility. You may have to remove the child, but there is a regulated crisis nursery in the facility. If the kid goes to foster care, 100 kids are going to cost us $4 million. 1,000 kids are going to cost us $40 million. 10,000, $400 million. Look at these numbers. This is not rocket science. This is easy. Same thing in after school. When these homeless kids move 2 or 3 times, an after-school program, it's a minimal cost, maybe $1,000 a kid a year. To get left back is $18,000 to $20,000 a year. Then health care. A clinic in these facilities, a community clinic. What is the big issue? Teaching parents, teaching these families primary care versus the emergency room, allowing the community to participate in the after-school program, the daycare program, in the health clinic, even the crisis nursery. Now you're rebuilding communities in a new way. It's not the way it used to be under the Great Society. There is no model city. There is no more funding coming in every direction. You're taking what exists and making it work. You're taking pieces that are out there now and putting them together. You're filling in the puzzle. You're creating a residential community resource center. Sports teams. Get somebody to sponsor it in the community, the gas station, the hardware store. They love to do it. Sponsor it, $1,000, keeps a kid out of a juvenile justice system. That'll cost you 30, 40, 50 grand a year. Keeps young women from getting pregnant, teen pregnancy. That's going to cost them a lifetime. You have these issues in job training. Why can't you do that in these community resource centers? We do. We do a job training program where they're assigned to other workers, and they have a role model now, and they get paid. And by the time they move up, they're making about $10 an hour, and they've got a resume. And then we find we're able to get people back to work. We're able to get them back to work, and once they're back to work, you're able to get them to move out and to live independently. Literacy, one of the biggest issues. Literacy in this country. 40% of Americans are illiterate. Go figure. Our science and math scores are going down. Our kids can't compete. We rank 20, 30, 40 around the world. Back into the system. Family literacy. We now see how it works with parents and with children together in family literacy programs. And alternative high schools. Alternative high schools not for the kids, but alternative high schools on site for the parents. So many of these parents don't even have a GED where you have to start. And studies show that if you get a GED, you're $100,000 ahead during the course of your lifetime. These are simple things that can be done. These are how you have to think about shelters of the future. There's no more room for the term shelter anymore. It's now community resource. It may be residential. It's open to the community. Then you integrate it into the community, and then communities don't scream when you have to open one of these facilities anymore because it has resources that all can share. That's a radical right turn that we should take. That's not big government. That's good government, okay? The era of good government has to come back. The era of rethinking what we do has to be reignited, not threatened you'll lose your funding if you don't stay on message. Since when is the message, Socrates would say, one word. You know what happened to Socrates in the end? Yeah, so maybe I shouldn't ask so many questions. They took him and they said, listen, in a democracy, mind you, in the father of all democracies, you're asking too many questions. You're stirring people up. They're asking questions about what is, what's right, what's wrong. So we're going to give you a choice here. You can leave town. Don't come back. Socrates, I don't think so. I like it here. Number two, you can stay, but you're going to have to be quiet. We don't want to hear a word from you. You're not allowed to hold any more of these classes. No more walking around with the sheepskin, wine, bread, and cheese. It's a big party. It's over, okay? And number three, of course, what Socrates chooses is you can stay and kill yourself, or we'll do it for you, okay? I can't believe that thousands of years later, we're in the same situation. It's either you're with us on homelessness or you're against us. You're either a voice in the wind or you're on board. Well, you know what? It's just the opposite. I'm not a voice in the wind. I'm a voice on top of the mountain telling you where the wind is blowing, and what you're doing on the other side, not you, but the people I'm talking about, you know who they are throwing you overboard, because I'm going to tell you, I say this all the time, I'll be back in 2 years, maybe 3 years. And you'll be back, and this issue will be worse, and this policy will be seen as a failure. The caution light is on. You know what the big element on rapid rehousing is? And there are people here, I'm sure, who run rapid rehousing programs. Listen to what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a bad program. I'm saying it's a bad policy when you use a one-size-fits-all approach. That's not good public policy. That's public stupidity. Our job isn't to get homeless people off the street. Our job is to get homeless people up on their feet. And we've lost sight of that. We've lost sight of that. So what I'm talking about is a residential educational policy, a residential educational facility. I'm starting a conversation here now. Go back and talk about this. All the educators that are here, you know what I'm talking about if you're dealing with these homeless kids. Do you know what it is to go to a shelter dressed like I am and have these kids come up in daycare, or in the after-school program and grab my hand and tell me, when I go up, I want to be like you, I'm going to be a policeman, I'm going to be a nurse. You know what it is? When I look at them and know that without the kind of intervention I'm talking about, they want what never will be, they expect what never has been, it's time to end that. I see a moment, and I've only seen this once before in my career, 18 years ago, when the population is so young, when the mothers and the children are so young, and the opportunity is so great, and yet the stupidity on the other side is so negative. This is the moment. This is the absolute moment to do this. So I'll leave you with that. I think I've said enough. I hope I've pointed in the right direction enough. But before I leave, I want to do one more thing, and then there's one more short video we're going to show you. I would be remiss if I didn't talk for a moment about why we're here, and why I'm here, why the Institute Children in Poverty, and why Homes for the Homeless is here. Homes for the Homeless was begun 27 years ago as a public-private venture by a public philanthropist, a private philanthropist, who met with a mayor and decided, having seen homeless families and visited shelters, that, you know, maybe I can help do something better about this. And as a result of that, this individual came forward, put private money forward to work with government, and Homes for the Homeless was born. And when it was simply one facility, and we thought it would be kind of short-lived, and I never expected to be here running it. I was in City Hall at the time. But it was an opportunity to make a change. And that change has been monumental. When I tell you 140,000 individuals, 90,000 kids, some 70,000 families with an educational emphasis, we have kids that have gone on to Swarthmore, that have gone on to Stanford, that have gone on to the great public education, the elite high schools in New York City, that have really become somebody, that come back actually to work in our facilities, to really, you know, show and be role models for the other kids that you can do this, this can work. Well, one individual is responsible for that. He went to the Stern School of Business, so he has business savvy, and he's here today. I just want to point him out. It's Leonard Stern, our chairman and founder. And on behalf of all the kids, Leonard, and everyone here, and the government of New York City, thank you. Okay. Well, I hope I've given you something to think about. We're going to show you one short video, and then I hope we have a great conference. Thank you very much.